Howard Bloom, founder of the International Paleopsychology Project and the Big Bang Tango Media Lab. In addition, founding board member of the Epic of Evolution Society and the Darwin Project. He's also a member of the New York Academy of Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Psychological Society. It goes on, the Academy of Political Science. Howard, you've got a resume that's too long. I can't read it all.
When I try to read it, George, I think that it's the diary of a madman. I think that's a series of delusions. It is quite insane.
One of the reasons I bring you on is I like to say paleopsychology.
Aha!
Now, what does that tell you about me, Howard?
Well, it tells me that you have an interest in looping gymnastics with your lips and tongue.
I am used to you being very psychological.
Right.
Very scientific.
Right.
I am not used to you being an investigative or a thinker of capitalism, and your thought process for capitalism is probably pretty darn good because in The Genius of the Beast, you do some incredible things. But I never thought you'd go in that direction.
Well, it's a peculiar thing, George. You know, in science, people talk about grand unified theories of everything in the universe. And when they're talking about grand unified theories, they're talking about theories that involve electrons and protons and perhaps the construction of stars. But they're not talking about some of the most complex and interesting things in the universe. And those most complex and interesting things in the universe are human beings who have consciousness, who have wild imaginations, daydreams, insecurities, pains, pleasures, ecstasies, and even gods. And unless you're dealing with the facts of humanity and the facts of humanity's extraordinary capacities, you're not dealing with this universe, because one of the most astonishing things this universe has ever given birth to is you, me, and the cultures we're a part of. So, and capitalism, we normally think of capitalism as just a mass of numbers and the stuff Naomi Klein is talking about when she's talking about all the bankers on Wall Street ripping us all off and causing a major crash. But capitalism is just part of the metabolism of this cosmos. It's part of the way that the cosmos takes things from the realm of nothingness into fantasy, then takes things from the realm of fantasy into reality, then makes those realities so ordinary that we take them for granted utterly and move on to the next fantasy. Capitalism is a fantasy generator and a fantasy instantiator at work on a day-to-day basis.
You call your work the genius of the beast. Who is the beast?
Well, the beast is the Western system. You know, this book got started in 2001 when I stood on my roof and I watched the World Trade Center burn. Then I got a call from a firm down in Texas that was wrapped around one of the leading CEO coaches in the country, a guy named Woody Buckner. And they asked if they could come up and visit with me for 4 days. Well, in those days, you and I were talking back in those days, I was stuck in bed for 15 years.
That's
and
right.
Any company whatsoever, I mean, George, when you're in solitary confinement like that, your brain aches in ways you've never imagined. So the idea of company was terrific. And this guy flew up, and we started talking about the fall of Enron, the fall of WorldCom, the fall of Arthur Andersen. We had a civilization that was in terrible trouble. And meanwhile, when other guests would come to see me from time to time, they would say, this is the worst civilization in the history of mankind. It is dying, and it deserves to die. And something, George, at the gut level said, this is not the worst civilization in the history of mankind. This is one of the most astonishing civilizations in the history of mankind. But if we think it's the worst civilization in the history of mankind, and we think it's dying, it's going to die. Because without spirit, without soul, without lifting your eyes, without going after a new aspiration, without trying to achieve utterly impossible new goals, no civilization does survive. In other words, a civilization that looks up goes up, a civilization that looks down goes down. And I tried to write a book that gave us a way of looking up about this civilization, that gave us a whole new way of seeing everything we do in our ordinary day-to-day life, especially the work that we do.
Well done. Well done. You know, you talk about being bedridden, Howard, for 14 years. Can you imagine that story I just had of that poor guy who was in a coma for 23 years, but he really wasn't in a coma? He just couldn't move?
My heart was aching because you know that for 5 years of those 15, I was incapable of speaking. And that meant when people walked into the room, first of all, people couldn't be brought into the room very often, but when people walked into the room, whole paragraphs, and it's true for this guy, I know, whole paragraphs, whole thoughts, half books go through your mind, things you want to share with the people in that room, and all you can do at most, and he couldn't even do this, all I could do was wiggle my eyebrows. Now, how many paragraphs and thoughts can you get across by wiggling your eyebrows?
I don't. And let me ask you this, because, this has a lot to do with your mindset of the genius of the beast. Did you want to live when you were locked up that way?
That is the very strange thing. You know that at one point I tried to kill myself. And it was a very strange process coming back to life. I lay in the bed like a corpse for 3 days, which means none of my muscles moved, and the circulation of my body was having a really hard time without large muscle movement. When I woke up, I discovered there's something stronger in me than me. And though the conscious me could no longer take the pain of a life with that illness, the unconscious me, the less than conscious me, had a ferocious desire to live. And what I'm trying to do in The Genius of the Beast is wake up the ferocious desire to live in this society, to wake it back up to phrases like American inventiveness, the American workmanship, to the idea that America can find new frontiers and conquer them, to the fact that there are new frontiers all over the place, to the fact that, we talk about resources running out. And the fact is that there are 1 trillion tons of raw material beneath our feet for every single human on this planet, and that represents opportunity. So in a sense, I'm speaking to that same thing that wanted to stay alive in me, that kept me alive despite 3 days on the brink of death. Yes, I still wanted to live.
And what could say, Howard, that our economy last year and maybe so far seems to have been on the brink of death, and look at you now. So maybe one day we'll be back on top, huh?
If we can rouse the spirit of this nation, if we can give it a sense of vision again, if we can give it a sense of impossible things that are worth pursuing, not just for us, but for all of humanity, then we can come out on top.
You're all ready for Thanksgiving?
Yes, and the book is very much a Thanksgiving book. I mean, I hate to keep coming back to the book.
That's what you're on for.
Yeah, but
don't worry about it.
But the fact is that when you've got people telling you that none of this stuff is worthwhile, you have to wake them up to what's worthwhile. And what's worthwhile? I mean, just look at the current recession that we're in. It is horrible, and a lot of people are out of work. And when you're out of work, you don't feel like living anymore. You don't recognize that you've got that will to live deep down inside of you. But in previous depressions, in the depressions in the 1790s, when there were famines, tens of thousands and millions of people died in a depression. They did not have food. In the 1800s and even the early 1900s, when there was a depression, there was a run on the banks, and you did not have money with which to pay your rent for the month, much less money with which to buy groceries for the week. All of that, every time we go into a period of expansion, we invent new things. Then we discover that there are problems with those new things, and we have a period of consolidation and crash, and we look at the new things and their problems, and we build safety nets. For example, in the crash of 1795, the idea of the soup kitchen was conceived. In the crash of 1817, the savings bank was conceived. In the Great Depression of 1929 to 1939, we had the FDIC that guarantees our savings accounts, and Social Security, not to mention the 30-year mortgage. So every time we go through one of these crashes, we find a way to take a step up on the ladder of complexity. So today, when we are having the greatest recession since 1939, our money still works, our banks still work, our credit cards still work, and we still have unemployment insurance, which was an invention that came out of one of these crashes.
Howard, when we come back, let's talk about all of these and much more. The Genius of the Beast. I'm George Norrie. We'll be back in a moment with Howard Bloom on Coast to Coast AM. Looking for a neat Christmas present? Why don't you put a little Streamlink package under the Christmas tree for the person you care about? It's only pennies a day, and they can get the iPhone app and download archived programs. It's really neat. Streamlink, part of coasttocoastam.com. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie. Howard Bloom with us, the Genius of the Beast. Howard, one of the subtitles in the book, Putting Soul in the Machine. I find this interesting because if I remember, because I've been trying to convert you for years,
right.
You're an atheist. You're an atheist.
Right. That's right.
How can an atheist write a subtitle that says Putting Soul in the Machine?
Well, soul to me is the deepest passions that we have. Soul to me is the stuff that really motivates us from day to day. Soul is in part related to that thing you were talking about before that keeps us alive even when theoretically we should want to be dead. And the genius of the beast is really all about soul in the machine. It's once upon a time Hegel, the incomprehensible German philosopher, said that history is the process of spirit trying to become flesh. And in a sense, he's right. And if we go back to the very beginning of what we are uniquely as human beings, you've got a situation 11,000 years ago where the world has gone through 60 major ice ages in 2 million years, the 2 million years in which we're becoming human, and all of a sudden things get sunny and nice and great, and the Middle East turns into a Garden of Eden, but somebody in the tribe gets this really whacked-out idea. There are these huge things that either get in your way or use them to sit up against from time to time, and they're called boulders. And this nut gets the strange idea that if you dig a bunch of these boulders out of the ground or roll them from the base of a cliff, and you roll them all together, and you do this for as many years as it takes to get a really huge collection of them, and you do it in just the right way, you'll have something nobody has ever seen before. Now, look, George, if you and I were around at the time, and this guy came over to you and me and said, look, if you just put in 4 years of your time pulling these irritants out of the ground, these good-for-nothing things out of the ground, and roll them together, we'll have something phenomenal. And you and I would have to say, look, we've been around since we were born, and boulders have never made anything phenomenal. And you're not going to take 4 years of my time to get involved with something like this that nobody's ever seen before. Well, the guy who managed to motivate you and me, who managed to put together the idea of putting the boulders together in the right way, was the guy who created the first wall. And with the first wall, you could form something new called a city. You could put it around an entire bunch of tribes. And when other people, the most dangerous thing to human beings are their fellow human beings. And when other human beings came to kill the men and make off with all the women and turn the children into slaves, they couldn't get through our wall. I mean, how in the world are you going to use a spear up against a wall? So for the first time, we'd have the opportunity to have tribes living together and choosing, you could choose to be a potter. I could choose to be a bead maker, a freedom that didn't exist before. But all this comes from one guy having a vision and being willing to persuade other people, lunkheads like me, to get involved in the project, and then seeing where that vision could possibly take us. And then usually when you pursue a vision and the new thing that you've been visioneering comes about, it produces all kinds of properties you never imagined. Well, that to me is spirit becoming flesh. And the guy who has to have the vision, have the persistence to promote with people like you and me, to organize people, to have the courage to stick with a really ridiculous notion for year after year after year, that guy has soul, and that guy is turning soul into new material realities. Does it make any sense?
It does. Howard, back in the 70s, an advertising executive by the name of Gary Dahl was kicking around some ideas with his friends. He wanted to come up with something new and innovative. It's a great story. And he said, you know what I want to do? I want to sell a pet that you don't have to feed, you don't have to walk, you don't have to groom. It doesn't die, doesn't become sick. It's not disobedient. He came up with a pet rock, and he made millions. Now, that's an idea of capitalism by using the genius of the beast.
Well, absolutely it is. And the other strange thing about that, George, is that most people would look at that pet rock and say, this is a scam. What does this accomplish for human beings? Does it make them more productive? Does it make them happier? Well, actually, the answer is yes.
Probably. Yeah.
Often we don't know what the things that we buy do for us. We can't articulate them. But the fact that we can't say what that pet rock does doesn't mean it's not doing something. It gives you a sense of security. I mean, what is a pet after all? Something that gives you a sense of security and you can relate to emotionally, and it calms you down before you start making the 4 phone calls that you know you're going to get totally rattled on because somebody at the other end of the phone, in all probability, the odds are is going to say no to you. You need something that gives you a sense of security, and we don't know where that sense of security comes from, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. And one of the jobs of capitalism or any economic system is to find those impossible to express things and satisfy them even in the absence of an explanation.
Where does greed fit into this, Howard?
This is a very good question. I've been thinking this out today because greed is, first of all, we know that really unconscionable things are going on right now, that the amounts of money, that there are two kinds of capitalism. There's creative capitalism and criminal capitalism. And whenever you get 100,000 people together, some of them are going to do criminal deeds. Well, right now, a lot of the criminal deeds are taking place on Wall Street. They're taking place to the extent that in 2008, just 9 banks alone, just 9 banks, not even 10, gave out $33 billion in bonuses. Now think for a minute. $33 billion is enough money to buy every house in a city of 250,000 people. That's unconscionable. But does greed actually get us anywhere? Well, once upon a time, I worked with a guy named Tommy Mottola. And Tommy Mottola eventually became head of CBS Records.
That's
and
right.
Tommy was motivated by greed. He wanted to make more money than his friend Walter Yetnikoff. If Walter got $10 million for something, Tommy wanted to get $15 million. If Walter got $20 million for something, Tommy wanted to get $25 million. Can't necessarily call that greed. It could be sheer competitiveness. But whatever it was, Tommy was in it for the money. Well, being in it for the money, if Tommy's self-promotion is at all accurate, he took that company from $600 million to $6 billion in revenues, or so he claims. I'm sure that he couldn't claim it if at least it weren't partially true. So sometimes people motivated by the strangest and most reprehensible things end up producing positives. What you really have to watch out for, judge them not by their motivation, but judge them by their deeds. If they do something that harms other human beings, stop them dead in their tracks. They're criminals. But if they're doing something that delights other human beings or in some way makes their lives more rich, it doesn't matter what motivates them. That's up to them.
Remember the movie Wall Street? Gordon Gekko
yes, greed
walking
is good.
around. Greed is good.
Yes.
Is it good? Is there any time that greed is good?
Well, okay, from my personal point of view, greed is reprehensible. I really loathe it. I despise it. I love people like Thomas Alva Edison, who talked about the fact that he would have 100 failures, but they weren't really failures. They were just his way of discovering the 100 things that wouldn't work. I love it when Thomas Alva Edison said that the most fun that he had was those 100 tries on his way to what other people called success. In other words, he loved what he was doing. The Wright brothers did it because they loved what they were doing. And I think the most creative people and the people who give the greatest gifts to their fellow human beings are the people who do it because they love what they're doing. But, hey, I'm prejudiced. I'm one of those people. And I shouldn't be prejudiced against people who are in it for the money as long as they do something of value. So if greed, I'm sure, has its place. You know, I am an atheist, but the fact is, let's imagine this universe is made by God, and if God has made greed to serve certain purposes, then who am I to criticize him, even if I don't like greed?
Howard, one of your favorites was the late Michael Jackson.
Oh, my God, yes.
Somehow this fits into your picture of the genius of the beast.
It fits into the picture of the genius of the beast because of a night that I had with Michael. I was given one of the principles in the book is called tuned empathy. And this book calls on you to have powers that only saints and saviors have previously been required to possess. And I have seen those at work in business, and I have put those to work in business myself. And in the process, I generated $27 billion in revenues for the clients that I was working for during my 20 years of field work in the corporate world and in the entertainment world. And I'm calling for you and me to hold our audience in our heart, to hold our customers in our heart, and to be their champions to the nth degree, to be their secular messiahs, to be their secular saviors. Now, Michael had this quality of tuned empathy in a way I have never, ever seen in my life, George. I got a call. I was here in New York. I used to keep a knapsack behind my desk. It had a laptop computer in it and a spare shirt and a toothbrush. And because I could get emergency calls at any time, I got a call at 4 o'clock in the afternoon saying, you've got to be out here in L.A. by 11 o'clock tonight. Michael is canceling his tour. This was in 1983. The Victory Tour was about to begin. Okay. And I flew out to L.A., and I went out to a studio lot where the brothers had been rehearsing their tour and sat in a cramped little trailer with Michael's 5 brothers and with Michael, and sat face-to-face with Michael. And Michael explained why he was canceling the tour. He was canceling the tour because his brother Jackie had come down with a bone chip in his knee. And to Michael's mind, his brother Jackie was the best dancer he had ever seen in his life, and his brother Jackie was the best choreographer he had ever seen in his life. And if his tour was going to go out without his brother Jackie, he wasn't going to be giving his audience his best. And when he explained this, it was a dark trailer. I don't know why we had so little light, but it was as if his chest opened and I saw 100,000 kids in there. Those were the kids that Michael was protecting. He was not going to let anybody do harm in any way to those kids. He was not going to let anybody cheat those kids. And to his mind, if his brother Jackie was not leading the dancing, he would be cheating those kids. And I can get very excited and passionate about things that I consider to be true, too. And I knew that Michael was going to be screwing his audience. He was going to be cheating his audience if he canceled that tour. He wasn't going to be giving them the gifts that he thought because they weren't going to believe him anymore when he announced the tour. And it was like Moses going up against Muhammad or something of the sort. He had all of the people, all of his chosen people in his heart, and I could see them in there, George. I could see them. And I had all of his chosen people in my heart, too. It was two prophets up against each other. And that's what I mean by tuned empathy, because we have the capacity inside of us to understand the emotions of hundreds of different kinds of fellow human beings, no matter how alien to us those human beings are. And many of those human beings are human beings we are capable of serving and uplifting in some way. And if we use our empathic powers, what are called our motor neurons, the neurons in our brain that reflect the way that other people feel, if we use those to feel those other people, care deeply about them, you could call it love. And if we champion them every day, the irony is we're going to make money, because you know I wasn't in that to make money. I was in the music industry, the entertainment industry, and the corporate business to learn things just out of sheer curiosity. But I made a lot of money for people by not caring about money, but by caring about other human beings.
Something is happening now that you will understand more than most, and it's something that needs to be stopped before it's too late. And we are creating an incredible disparity between the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor. The middle class is being eroded away. I'm concerned one day when the masses of people who will be the underprivileged decide they've had enough. They're fed up. They don't want to get stepped on anymore. What happens?
Well, first of all, I agree with you totally. The middle class is being eroded. It's been eroding since 1973. Up until 1973, we had a balance of payments surplus with the rest of the world. And in 1973, we experienced the Arab oil embargo, and there were lines a mile to 2 miles long waiting for gasoline, and it was the first time we had ever been held victim, at least since World War II, by people outside of our own shores, by the oil suppliers in the Middle East. But another thing happened that year that people didn't notice, and that was the first year we ran a balance of payments deficit since World War II. Well, at first everybody thought this was a temporary blip, and in fact in 1974 that blip went away. But by 1975 it was back again, and ever since then our balance of payments deficits have been going up and up and up and up. And we need to reverse that balance of payments deficit. We need to create things that are of value to the rest of the world if we're going to get that middle class back. But, of course, we also have to Obama, thank God, has got a sort of a bonus czar trying to cut down on the amount of money that the folks in Wall Street are just scooping up like crazy and feeding into their own bank accounts. Mm-hmm. That can help a little bit, but you're absolutely right. If we get to the point where we have a large and demotivated lower class and we have an upper class that's living it up, we'll be the way that Venezuela and Brazil were 40 years ago when they had these huge disparities, and they were among the most stagnant societies in the world. We'll be the way that the Middle East is today. Because they have these huge disparities, and we can't afford that. But again, it all comes down to finding or creating things that the world salivates for and making them to the best of our abilities ourselves. And I haven't told you about this, but last Monday I was on the phone with the former president of India conspiring about just such a thing because first of all, I'm extremely concerned. I think that this country is suffering a serious vision crisis.
Yes.
And we need a new vision, and that's what I'm trying to give with this new book. Secondly, I think, as you know, I think it's very important that we look up, and one of the ways we can look up is by going to space. One of the things we can offer the rest of the world is this huge amount of energy that's up in space, and that we've been tapping since 1962. One of the things I've realized in the last 2 weeks, and it came as a surprise even to Buzz Aldrin and Edgar Mitchell and the members of the guys in my space community, is that we have been harvesting solar power in space and beaming it back down to Earth since 1962. It started with one little satellite called Telstar, whose entire outside was just encrusted with photovoltaic panels. And that photovoltaic energy was then beamed down to Earth in the form of transmissions of electromagnetic waves. Well, today, that's $250 billion industry, the industry of harvesting solar power in space. and sending it down to Earth. But it comes down to us in the form of GPS signals. It comes down to us in the form of transmissions from CNN, from halfway around the world, giving us the latest news of the day. It comes out in all different direct TV. We're not used to harvesting it as electricity, but that stuff can be harvested as electricity, and we can goose the amount of it that we create tremendously using American launch technologies, the same sort of launch technologies that we've been using to launch the shuttle and to build the International Space Station. And what I've been trying to do with the former president of India is get the word into the White House that space-based solar power belongs on the list of green energies and renewable energies, so we can look up and not down. We've spent too long looking down.
Howard, a dear friend of mine, I admire her greatly, has always told me, and her philosophy is, whatever you do in life, you dig deep, not wide. And isn't this country going wide instead of deep in the economy and everything it's doing?
I think that this country is failing. What is it failing at? One of the things that it's failing at is it's failing to see some of the things that it's doing. That's why I wrote this book. But on the 23rd of October, President Obama went to MIT, and he gave a speech, and he talked about all kinds of amazing new technologies that he wanted to encourage, and he was actually putting money behind. And his quote was, he talked about windows that generate electricity by directing light to solar cells, lightweight, high-power batteries that aren't built but are grown, engineering viruses to create batteries, more efficient lighting systems that rely on nanotechnology. He even talked about engineering that will make it possible for offshore and wind power plants to deliver electricity even when there's no wind. Now, that one I still don't understand.
Yeah, how does that work?
And a couple of days later, a little-known agency called ARPA-E, meaning the Advanced Research Projects something or other for Energy, similar to the Defense Advanced Research Projects
DARPA,
Agency, right, DARPA, announced $1 million in grants for 37 new technologies, and they were exciting technologies. The press didn't pick up on this. In fact, the press corps that went to Boston with Obama and listened to that White House speech could not figure out what the hook of the story was. The hook was vision, stupid. It's the vision thing. It's the future. It's as if the press have totally lost the sense that a future exists. So I don't think it's that we're either going too wide or too deep. I think it's that we're not going up, that we're looking so persistently down, that we are depressing ourselves into failure.
Well, we've got to pull out of it because, we're going down a path. There are a lot of good people out there, Howard, that have some great ideas and innovation and everything else. But I'm just concerned, the situation in Afghanistan, without this getting political,
right, and
the situation in Iraq is going to continue to drain us morally and financially, and I don't see an end to this.
And I don't either. And I don't have I was doing a lecture last week to a group in Colorado via the phone, and when my portion of the lecture was over and it came time for questions, the host said, "Now, Howard, what are your solutions for Palestine? What are your solutions for Afghanistan?" I did not have good ones, George.
Stay with us. Howard Bloom, author of The Genius of the Beast, is next on Coast to Coast AM. And our special guest tonight is Howard Bloom, The Genius of the Beast, a radical revision of capitalism. More with Howard in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Howard, you tell of an incredible story of what you say unemployed bees. Explain that one. I like this story.
Well, we're getting down to the sense of meaning. I mean, we're talking about the fact that America has a vision deficit. And it's up to people like you and me, articulators, to express it. It's mostly up to the president to express it. But even bees, you can see how bees suffer when they don't have a sense of meaning. A beehive breaks down roughly like this. 95% of the bees are nice conformists that do what everybody else does. 5% of the bees are nonconformists, and they go out on what seem to be self-gratifying runs that mean nothing, just indulging themselves. So the 95% of the bees that are all conformists will go out to the flower patch of the day, get some pollen, bring it back to the hive, and then go out for another load of cargo. Meantime, the explorer bees, the bees that seem to be doing nothing, the bohemian bees, the artists, are out wandering around, looping back and forth, seemingly going nowhere, just having a good time. But eventually, a problem develops. The bees that are out there doing what everybody else is doing come back with less and less pollen. And as they come back with less and less pollen, a strange thing happens to them. There's a set of unloaders inside the hive, unloader bees. And those unloader bees are in contact with the bees inside the hive, and they know what the hive needs. Now, if you and I are workers, of course, we'd have to be women to do this because they're all females, but if you and I are workers and we've just come back from the latest rose patch of the day, but the pollen is beginning to run out, early in the day, when we came back with pollen that was really needed in the hive, we were treated like superstars. The unloaders ran over to us. They made all kinds of fuss over us. They felt us with their antennae. They looked us over, and they unloaded our pouches, or hip pouches, these special bristle-carrying hairs, as rapidly as they could. But now we're showing up empty-handed. And the unloader bees come over, and they take one look at us. They just do a quick survey, and if we have nothing they find of value, they turn their backs on us in a way that is savage. It's called rejection by the bee researchers. And eventually, they won't come over to see us at all. And we'll go back out, convinced the same place for a paycheck is going to prove valuable. We're going to go back over to that rose bush over and over again, come back with less and less. But every time we come back, we're going to move more slowly. We're going to get more discouraged. We're going to have to go into the hive and beg for food because we're not finding any out there in the rose bush. And eventually we get so discouraged that we just stay in the hive in a state of total depression with no sense of meaning to our lives whatsoever. And then what happens? Well, those bohemian bees, the artists,
Yep.
the ones who were just off indulging themselves?
Mm-hmm.
Well, some of them have run into new sources of pollen and nectar. Some of them have run into new flower patches. And usually about 4 or 5 of them come back and they dance. They dance to advertise their finds. They dance to advertise the new flower patches that they've discovered. And you and I are suffering. We're wandering around in a daze. We need something to excite ourselves because bees are very much like humans. Our body temperature is even down. We're in such a state of depression. So what do? We go over to entertain ourselves by watching the dancing bees. And if one of the dancing bees manages to excite us a little bit and we become convinced that maybe she's onto something, because she's giving precise instructions on how to get to the flower patch with her little figure-8 dance, we will follow her instructions and go out to check out the site. And if we get excited about it, we'll come back and we'll become backup dancers. And of the 4 or 5 bees who are competing for attention, the bee who gets the greatest number of backup dancers wins. And then all of us discouraged bees, we're called unemployed bees by Thomas Seeley, the leading researcher on the topic. All of a sudden we have a sense of meaning again. All of a sudden we have a sense of purpose again. All of a sudden we go out to the new flower patch. We come back with our carrying baskets loaded with pollen and nectar and our bellies loaded with nectar. And the unloader bees, who were paying no attention to us when we had absolutely nothing to offer, all of a sudden come rushing over to us again, treat us like superstars, our body temperature goes up, and with great excitement, we go back to get the next load. So what does that tell you about what meaning is? What does that tell you about what excitement is about? What does that tell you makes our lives vivid?
And it's like us. It is a blueprint for us.
It's a blueprint for us, and it means that if you're a president, or if you're George Norrie, or if you're Howard Bloom, it's our job to come back and point to a destination. Once upon a time there was a president named Kennedy, and his first 22 months in office seemed to be muddling around. What's worse, there was a 2-year recession during the beginning of his term. And suddenly, in his 22nd month in the presidency, he had his moon moment. All of a sudden, he had a sense of a mission and conveyed it to the American people. And he told us we were going to do the impossible, especially in a time of recession, that we were going to spend $80 billion on going to the moon. And he told us we were going to do it not because it was easy, but because it was hard. And he challenged our sense of accomplishing the impossible. He challenged our sense of doing something for the first time in the history of mankind. He challenged our sense of doing stuff on behalf of all mankind. Now, admittedly, it was hard for him to keep the motivation together and the budgets together to actually take us there. And, of course, Lyndon Johnson had to take over, and he had a hard time keeping the budgets together. But we made it to the moon. And the payoff, George, was only 800 pounds, a couple of suitcases full of rocks.
That's
if you
it.
count material payoff. But what was the spiritual payoff?
Huge.
Yeah, what was the payoff in terms of lifting our sense of what human beings could achieve? I mean, you know this, and I know this. Every time somebody we know who believes very passionately that he or she has his or her hands on a solution to the problems of our time comes to you or me and says, we need an Apollo program on this. Well, where did he get the concept of an Apollo program? From this absurd achievement, going to the moon, that lifted our senses of what it can be human. So, I'm talking now about things like material. You would relate to this stuff. You know that I am a spiritual atheist for all practical purposes, and I'm talking about the importance of material miracles, and I'm talking about the importance of a universe that tries to constantly transcend herself, that is constantly trying to lift herself above herself, and how we are part of that process of transcendence. And when I use terms like lift, terms that have to do with height, it sounds like just poetry and rhetoric, right?
It does.
But it's biological. I'm talking about biological stuff. We probably have talked, because we've had about 40 conversations, and we have probably talked about this before, but when lizards go up against each other to see who's going to be the top lizard in the group, and they do, it's a height contest. The lizards are trying to see who can raise his chin the highest, who can get the closest to the skies. When crustaceans, when lobsters or crayfish go up against each other in showdowns to see who is going to be the top lobster or crawfish, it's the same thing. It's a height contest. It's a contest to see who can use his very powerful tail muscles to lift his head the highest. Now, what does that tell you about humans and height? Or let me put it differently. There's an old Bloomism. Nature loves those who oppose her most. In other words, she loves those who break her rules the most. And back to the height thing. Now, first of all, the lizard that wins in the height contest goes through a massive biological and hormonal shift. The researchers who studied it said it's as if the lobster gets a whole brain transplant, and he gets
after winning, you mean?
After winning the height contest, after winning the contest to see who can break Mother Nature's most basic rule, the rule of gravity, the best, who can lift himself the highest. And his system, he's shot through with serotonin and octopamine, and those hormones and the way his neural receptors, his synaptic walls, interpret those hormones gives him a sense of magnificence, and he has a sense of power and being on top of everything. And in fact, his brain sharpens up. If you give him if you give him pieces of the solution to a problem, he will see how to piece them together. But the lizard or the lobster who loses goes through the opposite. Even serotonin, which is the antidepressant hormone, even in us human beings, his neural receptors interpret serotonin as a hormone of misery. Again, it's as if he has a brain transplant. But the winner, the one who lifts himself, gets a brain transplant that gives him a sense of being in touch with heaven. The lobster who loses gets a brain transplant that gives him a sense of being in hell. It's not coincidental that we think of heaven as up and hell as down.
That's right.
He walks around in a state of misery. He is utterly submissive. He tries to make himself almost invisible. And the same thing happens in lizards. Now, lizards and lobsters parted company on the tree of life approximately 600 million years ago, which indicates that this goes back 600 million years or more, that height and what it means to us creatures, as living creatures, is built in. And here's another little lesson on height. Now, bear with me, because I'm going to do anthropomorphism, and that's forbidden in science. I'm going to act as if dinosaurs could talk. But I'm really going to be talking about the kind of conversations they were holding with genetic differences. Once upon a time, 220 million years ago, there was a group of loony dinosaurs. And if they'd been able to talk instead of just expressing themselves through genes, they would have said, hey, we got this idea. There's all this space up above our head. We're going to go up there and see what we can find. Well, if you and I have been around and we have been conservative, crusty dinosaurs or conservationist dinosaurs, we would have said, what are you talking about? Look above your head. What's up there? Empty space. There are clouds and stars. Are you going to eat clouds and stars? Down here is everything good, everything green. Mother Nature's bosom is down here. This is where Mother Nature takes care of you. This is where food and shelter are and everything that you know. Well, guess what happened to the dinosaurs who were conservatives and stuck to the ground.
They're not here anymore.
That's right. They disappeared 65 million years ago. And the dinosaurs who decided to go up into that empty space where there was absolutely nothing to eat and nothing practical to be seen anywhere,
well, they're still around.
They're called birds. Right.
Yep.
Now, the other thing about those birds, George, is that there are twice as many species of birds as there are of us ground-hugging mammals, which means there are twice as many ways of making a living in the sky, in the nothingness, in the emptiness of space up there, as there are down here on the ground. And there's another little trick. The animals that took to the air, and this includes bats, mammals who took to the air, live approximately 60% longer than those of us who stick to the ground. So is Mother Nature trying to tell us anything here?
Probably a lot, Howard. It's right there under our noses.
Yeah, look up, look up, look up. And that's what, when we are spending so much time looking at carbon sequestration and looking at the limits of the resources that are running out on this earth and looking at the ways that we have plundered and raped this planet, all visions of limitation, all visions of looking down, that we are not looking up. And looking down is poison to us biologically. It is poison to our spirit. We're talking about the neurohormones of the soul here. It's poisonous to the human soul.
There's a big story going on. It'll break tomorrow. China is going to try to tell banks worldwide,
right,
cut back your lending. You're going too far. China, how can they do this? I guess because they own everything.
Because they own everything, and once upon a time we owned everything. But if we're going to own anything in the future, we're going to have to stake out a future where nobody else is. We're going to have to follow the paths of the dinosaurs that looked up. We're going to have the kind of courage that Kennedy had when he was in the middle of a recession in 1961 and 1962, and the courage to do impossible things. We're going to have to call on people to do things not because they're easy, but because they're hard, because this is the Chinese century, and it's our job to make sure that it is not just the Chinese century. I have two friends who have spent the last couple of years working in China, and they find the lack of freedom to speak absolutely stifling. You made a statement. I don't know if the listeners could hear it because it ran during the news period.
That's our little promo we send to the station. So
okay, well,
you heard it because you're on hold.
Okay, well, I hope they heard it too, because you said that this is one of the most contentious times you have ever lived through, and it is very hard for the people on the left to talk to the people on the right. And instead of having civil conversations these days, they turn their backs and reject each other. I mean, I'm paraphrasing you, but did I get the essential message right?
Yes, you did.
And one of the things that makes this country utterly unique is the ability to have rich civil discourse. We invented something back at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution, around 1760, that no other culture on this planet, no other civilization has ever invented, and it's called the protest industry. And it began with the anti-slavery movement in the 1760s to 1780s. And within roughly 28 years of that movement's creation, of its birth, it had already achieved major legislative success and had gotten slavery banned in England. Well, in 1848, that movement took a move up with Henry David Thoreau, who objected to the Mexican War in 1848 and came up with the concept of civil disobedience. And the concept of civil disobedience leaked over to India, and it led to Gandhi and his massive use of an American invention, civil disobedience. But this is the only civilization that has ever encouraged this kind of richness of discourse in the history of mankind. China does not have this kind of richness of discourse. And more countries are following the Chinese model. It's called the new autocracy. Venezuela is being swayed by it. Brazil is being swayed by it. All of the countries in Southeast Asia, according to my correspondents in Cambodia and Laos and Malaysia, are being swayed by it right now. And if they fall into step with the Chinese model, yes, they're going to keep the richness of entrepreneurialism because the Chinese have learned to do that since Deng Xiaoping, but they're going to lose the richness of freedom of speech and, even more important, of the kind of tolerance that lets me sit down with a guy named Latif today at the tea lounge who's black and lets us exchange ideas ferociously, because the Han or the Chinese are very racist. The Han race is it. Any other race is subjugated in China. We need this richness. I mean, one of Jim Fallows, who's the national correspondent for The Atlantic, one of his insights over the course of the last 20 or 30 years is it's the richness of this mongrel society that makes us special. And this is a society worth living in and dying for, frankly. But we don't see it, and I'm trying to wake us up.
Do you think we're going to pull out of this in the next couple of years, or is it going to be longer?
You know, a lot of it's going to depend on you and me. We are the articulators. A lot of it's going to depend on the success of the little thing that I was doing with India last week and today to try to get new messages into the White House, into the Obama administration. And I wasn't kidding around. This is real stuff, and we were doing it just a half an hour. I was on with India just a half an hour before you and I got on the phone. It's going to depend on the listeners, the people who are listening to us right now. We're all going to have to pull very hard to not so much reject the negativism, because it's useful to look at pitfalls. You don't want to fall into a well and break your neck, because you're looking at the stars. But you do want to look at the stars, and we're all going to have to push for vision. We're all going to have to push for grounded optimism, for an optimism that we have a right to because we can follow it up.
But you're bullish.
George, as of 3 weeks ago, when one of the members of the panel on the Washington Week in Review on PBS, the show that I watch religiously every week, all of a sudden said, we're behind on green energy and there's no way in hell we'll ever catch up, all of a sudden I became very pessimistic. But one of the facts of life, one of the facts of spirit, one of the things that made Edison remarkable when he regarded 100 failures not as failures, but 100 ways of finding things didn't work in order to find the one way that did, you have to persist, and you have to go with your vision. You have to stick to it, and you have to push and push and push and promote and proselytize. Try to win other human beings over to your point of view, or you can never get ahead. It takes 100 failures to make one success.
What if they don't want us to succeed, Howard? What if they want us to collapse?
Well, right now we are very fortunate because the Chinese own so much of us, they own so much of our debt, that it would be very unwise of them to want us to collapse. In the long run, I'm sure once upon a time we wanted other people to collapse.
Sure.
Deep down in our darkest of hearts. It's called schadenfreude, a joy in other people's failures and other people's miseries.
A sickness.
But we have to succeed no matter what anybody else wants. We have to do it ourselves. Again, back to the concept of transcendence. What is Mother Nature doing when she creates creatures who break her own laws? She's bootstrapping. She's coming up with ways of transcending herself. She's coming up with ways of transcending her most basic limitations. She is saying to herself, I will have no limitations because I choose to give birth to creatures like birds. If nature can do this persistently for 13.73 billion years, and she's been doing it, so can we.
We'll be back in a moment with Howard Bloom on Coast to Coast AM. Now, don't forget, live program for you on Thanksgiving night, so after you've had your turkey or hamburgers or whatever you eat on Thanksgiving, just turn your radio on to Coast AM. We'll be back in a moment with Howard Bloom. Next hour, we'll take phone calls with Howard. Lots more, though, to talk with him. In just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. In our day-to-day existence, Howard, we use about, 10% of our brain power?
There is no way of actually measuring, but my guess is yes. And one of the reasons is something that we usually don't look at all, and that is that when you see people at work, if you go to the Motor Vehicle Bureau, which has become infamous for this, and you see the people behind the desk, do you see people who are excited about their work?
Nope.
And when you have somebody like Thomas Edison or the Wright brothers who are excited about what they do every minute of the day and would rather work than do just about anything else in life, do you see people excited about their work?
Yes.
And what would you say is the difference in energy output of the people at the DMV and a Thomas Alva Edison?
Huge.
So there you have it. That's the missing part of the brain that's not at work today. And one of the things that I think is a problem with society these days is we don't recognize it, but we are tools of an ancient technology.
But Howard, you have to have someone working at the DMV.
Well, you do, but we have a problem because we have an old system that was developed around 1800 called bureaucracy. And the word bureau referred to two hot new technologies of 1800. One was the desk, and the other one was a central office. And actually, there's a third. The word bureau means both desk and office. But there was a third, a really important invention called the central file cabinet. In other words, if you gather, up to that point, people worked in their homes. But if you gathered people in a central office and they worked around a central filing system, all of a sudden they had access to the same information, and processing information became a whole new thing. Well, unfortunately, it is now 200 years later, and we've gone beyond the desk and the office. The place I work at a club called the Tea Lounge. In other words, I take my laptop there every day. I take my cell phone with me, and I can work anywhere where I can get a wireless signal.
Okay.
I see about 40 other people. I convinced this club to put wireless in about 5 years ago. And as a consequence, anywhere from 40 to 100 other people are sitting there with their laptops. Now, when those people are sitting there with their laptops and their iPhones in front of them, guess what level of excitement they have? They do not look like the people at the DMV.
No, they don't.
They look far more like Thomas Alva Edison. They are so glued to what they are doing. They are so ensconced in what they are doing. They get so much inherent value out of what they're doing that they work with that other 90% of the brain that's missing in the people at the DMV. Maybe they're only working with an extra 10% of it or extra 20% of it, but it is a substantial amount. And we have to now that we do have laptops, now that we do have cell phones, now that we do have wireless signals, we have to find a way to incorporate those people who don't need to be in an office all the time, who can be out among their constituents. One of the concepts in The Genius of the Beast is called management by walking outside, and it goes something like this. We went through a slam down like the one we're going through now in the 1980s. 1981 was the biggest recession that we had since the Depression. And one of the reasons that we went into it was the Japanese were eating our socks. The Japanese, we had decided to go into making automobiles that we consciously made for obsolescence, so people would have to buy new ones all the time. It was called planned obsolescence. You and I remember that. A lot of people don't. And the Japanese decided to make cars you could rely on. We were charging extra for radios and air conditioners and all kinds of things. The Japanese put the radios and air conditioners in the cars as standard. We had cars that you had to service every 6 months or so, and that had pings, knocks, and all kinds of strangenesses. The Japanese had cars with no pings, no knocks, and they seemed to take pride in the fact that their cars worked month after month after month, plus they seemed to care about you when they serviced your car. So by the early 1980s, we weren't selling cars to the Japanese anymore. The Japanese were selling cars to us. Yeah. When we crashed in 1981, a bunch of books came out trying to figure out what the Japanese were doing right that we were doing wrong. One of them was by Tom Peters, In Search of Excellence. And that book talked about management by walking inside. And that meant if you're the CEO of a company, don't just sit in your office. Don't just meet with your other vice presidents. Go out walking around the shop floor. You've got 135 smart guys running your company, but you've got 35,000 workers, and every one of them comes to work every day with a beef, something he knows could be done better. And if you find those 35,000 beefs, those 35,000 ways of making things better, you can incrementally increase the quality of what your company does. That was management by walking inside. The Genius of the Beast calls for management by walking outside, being among your customers, being among the people that you serve, being among them so that you can use your tuned empathy, so you can feel the way that they feel, so you can anticipate their needs. And there was an example in the book of a woman that I met who did this. I was having my hair done at a Japanese haircutting salon in Manhattan because it was the only place in my building. I didn't want to have to walk anywhere. I couldn't stand the time away from work. And the woman next to me came from, I believe, Revlon, and she spent 6 months of the year working at a cosmetics counter out in Minneapolis or Seattle or San Diego. 6 months working with her customers, 6 months going through the agonies while they tried to decide what new makeover they wanted, 6 months of seeing what they felt was missing from their lives. And then she flew back to the corporate office in New York. She went directly to the research and development department, and she looked at all the new colors they were developing, all the new textures of things they were developing, and all the new applicators. And she said, I want that in that color, with this texture, with that applicator, because she knew what these women wanted. Well, with the laptop and the cell phone, you can do management by walking outside far more effectively than ever in the past. And it would be useful if some of those people from the DMV spent part of their workday among the people that they serve, rather than just hidden behind a counter in an office that they can easily shutter away from their public.
Every once in a while, we have a feature on the program called Great American Success Stories.
Yeah.
So we've had people on who have started from basically nothing. I had
Right.
Ron Rice, who was the founder of Hawaiian Tropic. He started by mixing chemicals in his garbage can. He still
Neat.
has that in his house in Florida. Then we had David Oricon, the vacuum guy.
Right.
And what's the next series of inventions? So we've got those people on. You know, we were trying to get Bill Gates on, for example. And, you know, we see what he's done with the world. What's left? What's left to invent, Howard?
What pulls countries out of recession, aside from looking up and looking toward visionary new technologies, is reinventing the tools of production, increasing productivity. That's how you get to pay people more, when you increase their productivity dramatically. And I think the greatest morasses, the greatest swamps that are just swallowing our energies these days are the great bureaucracies. And the great bureaucracies are the legal system. You know, you could spend 5 years in court on something. Now, if you have $10 million, you'll win the case, even if you lose. If you can hold somebody up in court for 5 years,
you'll win.
You can strip them of their savings. Even if you lose the case, you've won, because you've destroyed their lives.
Yeah.
Another system is the medical system. The bureaucracy in the medical system is ferocious. It's appalling. If you spend any time in a hospital, it's nightmarish. They don't even know how to treat a human as a human anymore. Another great bureaucracy is the government, and the fourth great bureaucracy is the corporate system, because it all operates on bureaucracy. And in my time in corporations, the worst sin that I saw was that people despised their own customers. And they could do that because they were so insulated among themselves, particularly at BlackRock in the days of CBS, which was a great company. And even in this great company, people despised their customers. So using the laptop and the cell phone to invent a way beyond bureaucracy, I think, is an unseen way to take us miles and miles forward. The next great inventions, we're always wrong about. George, we are always wrong about.
I guess if you could predict the next great inventions, you'd invent them.
Yes. I mean, you know, fantasy, one of the things I'm trying to cover in this, because it's the spiritual dimensions of what we call capitalism and an economy in this book, is the way that fantasies power an economy. Because there's something called an infrastructure of fantasy in there. And if you've got time for the story, it goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a loony guy in Paris. It was 1860, or it was 1865. The American Civil War had just concluded. He was trying to make a living as a stockbroker. It really wasn't working out. He was working for his brother. And he had a nutty notion. There was a huge, huge cannon that had been invented at the end of the Civil War in America, and it could hurl a thing the size of a king-size bed, the size of a Volkswagen van. So he started writing. Now, how are you going to make money as a writer? Anybody in his right mind knows you can't make money as a writer. But he started writing. What's worse, the story was about this. It was about taking an entire carriage, taking off the wheels, putting it into the mouth of this cannon, and then lighting the gunpowder underneath it. How could you possibly have that carriage survive? Much less, because he had another idea, put people in the carriage. Mm-hmm. And you're now going to fire this carriage out of a cannon, and you think anybody's going to live through this experience? It was a ridiculous idea. And beyond that, he wanted to fire this thing all the way to the moon. That's what his story was about, firing this carriage all the way to the moon. Now, if you'd been his wife and you'd wanted to see a paycheck at the end of the week, what would you have said?
Let's get to work here. Let's do
Jules,
a real
you're crazy.
job.
Stop monkeying around with this stuff. It's never going to make us a living. I'm going to leave you if you keep doing this kind of thing. Well, he managed to find a publisher for his work, and his work was called From Earth to the Moon, and with it he managed to invent science fiction. And but there's a remarkable thing that happens with human passions. Human passions wrap themselves around things when we're 5 years old, and 10 years old, and 15 years old, and never will quit. That's called imprinting. And I call those things passion points. Well, around the turn of the century, there were two guys who grew up as little kids reading Jules Verne's From Earth to the Moon. And they imprinted on it. Their brains just wrapped themselves around it. They spent their whole lifetime trying to think of how to achieve in reality what Jules Verne had dreamed about. And they had another idea. Don't put the explosives in the mouth of the cannon. Put them in the back of the carriage. Now, George, how crazy is this? You want to be a passenger in a carriage? Would you put the explosives in the back? How likely are you to survive lighting those explosives? Nonetheless, they pursued this idea, and there were certain precedents for it. The Chinese had invented these things called rockets. We had used those rockets in the War of 1812. They were called Congreve rockets.
Firecrackers, right?
Yeah, and rockets, the Congreve rockets that are the rockets' red glare bombs bursting in air in our national anthem. But rockets take people into space, this was a ridiculous idea. So both of them wrote books. One of them was named Tsiolkovsky. He was in Russia. He wrote a book about how to get into space using rockets. The other one was a guy named Oberth. He was in Germany, and he wrote a book about how to get into space building rockets. Well, guess what? In the next generation of kids, there were a couple of kids who at the age of 5 and 10 read not just Jules Verne, From Earth to the Moon, but also Tsiolkovsky and Oberth. And they grew up with their brains wrapped around this passionate notion of getting people into space with rockets. One of them was named Wernher von Braun. And he eventually, well, of course, he had a stroke of luck. It was hideous luck. But he got a huge investment in his rocket dreams from the head of his country, because his country was going to war, and the head of his country wanted to destroy England and thought that a rocket would be a good way to do it. Send a lot of rockets filled with 2,000 pounds of explosive each to London. That head of government was Adolf Hitler, and this program was appalling and demonic, but it gave Wernher von Braun the budget with which to pursue his dream, and eventually he brought that dream to the United States. Another dreamer named Walt Disney bought into it and put von Braun on television on Sunday nights for a while, and thus was born Tomorrowland.
I remember that show.
Yeah. And as a consequence, we have a space program. That's how we got men to the moon, through an infrastructure of fantasy, through men coming up with ideas that their wives would have said were crazy, and their wives would have told them, get back to work and get back to making us a paycheck. This is nonsense. So when humans pursue dreams, I know this sounds hackneyed. I know it sounds like When You Wish Upon a Star in Disney cartoons, but it's true. When men and women begin to pursue dreams, and they pursue them relentlessly, not just during their own lives, but in multi-generational projects, we humans make those dreams come true. Hegel was right. History is about spirit becoming flesh. It is about fantasy becoming matter and becoming the mundane, becoming the everyday, becoming the ordinary. And you and I are part of this process, and so is everybody that we're talking to. And what is the genius of the beast about? Very much it's about this process.
What do you tell the man or woman who's laid off, can't get a job, maybe they're trapped, they're in their 50s, and they just can't get a job, and if they do, it's not going to pay them what they were making? What do? They're still young, Howard.
I know, and I'm 66, and I'm still young as far as I'm concerned. And
Sure.
Buzz Aldrin, who's a very close friend, is now 79, and he's still young as far as he's concerned. And what you tell them, and it's nothing you tell them is going to be satisfactory except I have a job for you, show up on Monday morning. But one thing that you can tell them is look into your heart and find those passion points. Find those things you wanted to do more than anything else in your life ever since you were small. And then pursue those things. Find whatever government grants are available to put you to school in those subjects. Pursue those subjects, because even if they do pay you less money, those are your dreams come true. Those are the things that excite you the most in life. That's where you'll be able to make the greatest contribution to your fellow men, not by going to work in some field that you regard as drudgery, but by going to work in some field that you regard as a dream come true. Now, that's not easy, and it's not at all easy. Nothing is easy when you're out of work. Especially, it's not easy to get yourself out of bed in the morning, and it's not easy to get the courage to even make a phone call, because you think you're so worthless that nobody would want to talk to you on the phone. But if you pursue those things that excite you, you stand a far greater chance than by pursuing those things that do not excite you at all.
Had the Soviet Union not gone into Afghanistan, had the Soviet Union gotten to the moon before we did, what would have happened to them? Things changed? You're raising a really, really interesting point, because when I started running into refugees from the Soviet Union back in the 1980s who were driving cabs in New York City, you know that during the 1970s and 1980s, the mortality rates in the Soviet Union were going up. Men were dying at the age of 59, which is unheard of in the modern world for a developed country. And they were dying at the age of 59 because they weren't allowed to pursue their dreams within the Soviet system, because they were doing things they considered to be drudgery in the Soviet system. Yes, a small number of people were able to pursue their dreams, guys like Kalashnikov, who wanted to make the greatest gun in history, and the guys who were in the Russian space program. But you're right, if they had gotten there first, would that have done anything
to lift their spirits in a way that would have kept them alive and flying, because they died of discouragement. They died because they gave up.
And it would have been a double whammy to our ego.
And it would have been a double whammy to our ego and set us flying. It would have given us the extra gumph that we needed, the extra adrenaline that we needed to pursue space even harder. In fact, that's what did get us to put men on the moon. The Soviets putting Sputnik up there and being ahead of us was ultimately what got us to go to the moon. And we knew the Soviets had a moon program. And one of the things that Kennedy knew was that if they got there first, it was going to look very bad for us, and we had to keep our chin up, just the way that lizards have to keep their chin up in these chin-raising contests they have. We had to keep our chin up and had to continue to be a leader, and people were not going to look to us as a leader if we were in second place to the Soviet Union. So these competitive factors came into play, and one of the reasons that we're dying spiritually right now is because we don't have a sense of competition. We have a sense that even if we lay down and go to sleep forever, we will still be number one. And that isn't true, and we've forgotten what it is to be a country that's in the middle or on the bottom and to be kicked around and not to have control over our own destiny. And that is shameful. We need to wake people up. One of the things we're using with space solar power is the fact that Japanese have just put $21 billion into developing space solar power. We are hoping that that will wake up America's competitive spirits, but frankly, the media, in the same way the media didn't cover any of those statements that Obama made about all the exciting things that we're doing in new energy technologies, the media isn't covering the competition anymore. It's tucking its head under the ground the way that an ostrich allegedly tucks her head under the sand.
Well, that's a good point, Howard. We're going to come back and take phone calls with you. What's your favorite part of the Genius of the Beast?
I love the fact that there's a transcendence engine at work. I love the fact that this universe is accomplishing material miracles. I love the fact that this universe is doing things that only gods and saviors have ever done, and I love the fact that it's doing it through you and me. I just love seeing the creativity of the evolutionary process at work, and it's at work every day in the work that you and I do.
Howard's two websites linked up at coasttocoastam.com, Howard Bloom, BLOOM.net, BigBangTango.net as well. By the way, we got a lot of folks who wanted to get my email address again over the weekend, so it's George at coasttocoastam.com. We'll be back in a moment. Phone call time with Howard Bloom on Coast to Coast AM.